WIFTBPM.
Sissy's Taco Bar Pop-Up is back with more hours and more days. Check them out at their new pop-up location at The Woodlawn, located 1200 East 79th Street. Sissy's Taco Bar offers authentic street tacos infused with international soul. Now every Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday at The Woodlawn from 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. New vegan tacos have been added to the menu too. Visit sissytacobar.com for more info.
All right, well, Angela Oya Fumike. As you know, this is I Do, I Did, I Don't on the What's in It for the Black People media. Start our way into this journey of divorce and healing.
So we came together under a survival mentality, not under a friendship of being in love. First being friends and then being in love, or growing in love. We came together under, we're trying to survive, we're two kids trying to survive. Okay, we're going to survive together, because if you're handling this end of the survival and I'm handling this end,
Years that you've accepted this is what it's been, and now you've made this decision, and he wasn't there. He wasn't even seeing that you were done.
Here's what it was. Just like I ignored on the front end that he didn't love me like that, he was so disconnected from me by the point when I decided to leave that he didn't see the writing on the wall.
Wow.
Just didn't see it. But he didn't know that woman because he never took the time to meet her.
Mm-hmm. And so you created your plan, and that's key, I think, in having a plan. If you are going to, whether you're deciding together that this isn't going to work any longer and we're splitting, and having a plan on how you're going to move forward is pretty key. You knew at this point I had to create your own plan, and you were moving forward with that. In my case, I didn't have a plan. Things happened pretty abruptly, and I was creating the plan on the fly along the way. I don't recommend that. You forgive yourself. You forgive you. Do the work of forgiving yourself that you may be able to actually forgive others.
You better be careful. Baby, be careful. This is a baby making tone. Better be careful what your radio on. This is a baby making tone. Better be careful what your radio on. You let down your hair when you're feeling sexy.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. Happy Easter. Yes, you are tuned in to I Do, I Did, I Don't on What's in It for the Black People media. This is Tasha Napper here, talking about how you become better, how you get to the other side of divorce. Lots to educate you about, but it is Easter. Yes, this is me. I know you guys are like, wait, who's this? Who is this? Different hair, dressed up. It's Easter. And of course, this is the first time, actually, you guys, that I have put a dress on, I think, since coronavirus started. So I'm enjoying it. Took full advantage of the holiday to come on, to dress up, get all gussied up for Easter. I just had so many memories this morning as I was getting started and getting dressed. I remember being young. We all have these Easter memories, these Easter dresses, the pictures, the hair, the whole thing. And I think some people are still doing it despite coronavirus. There are some that are deciding to go back to church this Sunday for the first time. So you all enjoy that. But the memories that I was having. So I'm thinking back when I was younger, and my mom and my aunt were so excited about Easter one year. So a couple months ahead of time, they started sewing. Now, my aunt could really sew her butt out. So they were sewing, making dresses and suits, like pants and a blazer suits for my two brothers. And for all of us, so there were 3 boys and 3 girls, I think, as between my mom and my aunt. She only had 1 child at the time. And so they were at it and working for 2 months, getting these dresses and suits all made. And we were clean and, got our things on Easter. They were so excited. Everybody looked so good. We probably were about an hour late for church, but we got there. When you got to get 6 kids ready and get them out of the door, get them fed first, get them out of the door. A whole lot of work to do. But that's a fond memory. It's probably one of the only Easters that I really remember deeply as a kid, because it was just so, it was just such a big deal to them, and they were so excited. And all of these made from, from scratch, I guess you could say, outfits for all of these kids. So you all enjoy Easter. Take your time, get dressed up. But yes, this is Tasha. You have tuned in to the right broadcast on What's in It for the Black People Media. I do, I did, I don't. So yes, I got new hair. It is mine. You just never see it like this, see it straight and down. It's a lot of work to do this. But my colorist got me right yesterday, and not yesterday, Friday. She got me right on Friday, and I decided, hey, let's do the whole thing. My sister-in-law's an esthetician, so she's been getting me straight with the products I need to use on my face, and it's just all working today. It's all working. Let me tell you. So I walked out of the door on my way to the studio today. I'm walking out, and these 2 cars are driving by. And I look up as I'm closing the gate. I look up, and this white dude and his dog had just darn near broke their neck looking at me. I was like, hey, I'm working it today. I got it today. This is great. So happy Easter. You guys go out, have fun, dress up. Enjoy the day. We don't get a lot of time to do this. So good morning to all of y'all. I see my good friends on. I'm excited to see you guys this morning. And because it's Easter and a religious holiday, I thought I would spend some time talking about the institution of marriage and divorce as it relates to religion, as it relates specifically to Christianity, because it's Easter. And why not? And I think there's some really great nuggets that I have learned in some of the research that I've done. There are so much that I could still learn about this. So as I'm sharing this, I'm getting past the, hey, it's Easter. I want you all to make sure that you are sharing the broadcast. Make sure that you like, that you follow, that you share. This is good information, and we know somebody that can use this information. So today we're going to talk about what are the biblical origins of marriage and divorce then, and how does this influence what we see happening today? So, there is, I'm going to go way back so just stay with me, because I'm going to go all the way kind of to the beginning and come on through this thing as we talk about this. So you think about Adam and Eve being first created, and we say that is the first marriage, that God performed the first marriage in the Garden of Eden. He put them together, said, man, it's not good for him to be alone. He created this woman to be with him, to help him, to support him, to live life out with him. And he told them to procreate. And so a lot of our biblical thoughts about marriage are absolutely grounded in that as an institution created by God for man and woman, and with some guidelines around how they live together. But the Bible doesn't. It says a lot about it, about how men are to treat their wives, how wives are to treat their husbands. But you don't hear as much about what was really more so than the purpose, kind of how was that lived out? How did that take place? And so what got me to thinking about this is several things. Last show I did with the attorney Alfred Ivy, we were talking about at the end about how we spent so much time talking about money as we talked about divorce, and not about the other things that were a part of a divorce, about how do people fare afterwards? What kinds of things do you need to make sure you have in place for communication, for the children, all of that stuff. But he felt like we spent a lot of time talking about money. And part of me went, well, isn't divorce about money? Isn't that really what it's about when it comes down to it? And part of that is true, part of that's not. So let's go back. Let's think about God's created this institution. Then you have people, let's say way, way back, you got, let's think caveman days, okay? So you got these men and women who are living and they need to survive. They need to survive. And they are still procreating, but they're doing that in a way that is not necessarily what it looks like today. So there's a lot of research that says that they might get together for 3 or 4 years and then wander off, start a new family somewhere else. And that might have been okay at the time because people could support themselves. But I'm going to think about this from let me think about it from more of a European perspective as we're thinking. So I want to give you your frame of reference to think about this. So, all right, you think about this European frame of reference. And you think about, or maybe I shouldn't say European to start with, but one of the things that Dr. Joy Degree talks about is this axiology. These axiologies, she's a social scientist. She does an amazing job, amazing work. She is one of the folks who did the book called, she has the theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so in listening to her, she talks about these axiologies of the world and how we see and operate differently and how it's influenced us culturally, influenced how we think, influenced how we work, all of these things. And so if I'm thinking about that society and, you're the climate, let's just talk the climate, right? So the climate you've got a few months of sunshine where you have to get all of your planting done, and you've got a lot of cold weather. And so it really shapes how you plan. It shapes how you move about doing your daily work and how you survive. So it's cold. You need to, before you probably caveman days, you're able to get what you need in terms of food, both men and women. They could forage and get fruit and vegetables and nuts. And so women could do that, right? But once things started to shift and they needed to do more in terms of eating animals, then that's a little bit of harder work to do, especially if women are caring for children. And so if women were to survive, they needed to attach themselves to someone that was going to help them to survive and to help them to eat, because no food, you don't eat, you don't live. And so these marriages started to be kind of created informally in terms of just a matter of survival. So when you look back at history, a whole lot of marriages really related to very practical agreements in order to survive. They were very practical. It had nothing to do with love. It was all about, here's the agreement, and we're getting together because we're both trying to survive. And for men, it was a lot of this was about a guarantee that the children of the offspring would be their biological heirs. And so you look back at the institution, marriage primary purpose was to bind the women and men together, but it was to also give the man assurance that his heirs would be his biological children. So I said we would go way back. We're talking about kind of moving and how society changes and how the climate changes and how the movement changes over time, right? So you've got these folks who are now trying to figure out, how do I eat? How do I live, especially as women on my own? Now you're moving towards more agrarian society where there are lots of land rights. Okay, so now you're growing your crops in order to eat. And in that society, you've got maybe 4 or 5 months to grow. You've got a store. You've got to, so things were quite tight in terms of the timing. And you see so much influence there because the family and the creation of heirs was about maintaining your property. And it also was about making sure that you had the labor to do the work that you needed to do when it was time for planting and growing season and harvesting. And so during those times, you might have had an agreement, a covenant for marriage, but it may not have been enforced, right? So a man could just decide, I'm done. I'm going to leave. I'm going to start something else, go off somewhere else. And that would leave the women and children destitute. And so a lot of the church's perspective on marriage was a moral perspective. And it was really about making sure that women and children were not left destitute. So let's think back to the Bible when Moses tells the people that they are able to divorce, that they can actually give their wife a certificate of divorce. He did that really to protect the women and children. And it was about making sure that God's daughters were well taken care of in the event that a marriage broke down. And marriages could break down. There were a lot of polygamist practices over time, but the covenant could break down for several different reasons, okay? And so the church becomes more involved now in these agreements that are made, or these contracts that are made, which are called marriage. The church becomes more involved. And as the Roman Catholic Church specifically got more involved and became a more powerful institution in Europe, and the blessings of a priest became necessary for a legal marriage, for it to be legally recognized. So now you've got these marriages that have now become more than just sort of the social contract, but they have become legal contracts as well. So they are part religion, right? And the covenant, and this is the agreement, and this is the moral piece of the relationship, and then part legal contract, because this now relates to the division of property and the children and all those other things that happen after marriage. So I found it quite interesting to go and look back at that evolution of marriage over time, because when we had that conversation again now, all we talked about was money, because the legal part of marriage is very much about money. It's about the division of property. In fact, I'm going to read you kind of a legal definition of what this is. A divorce decree establishes new relations between the parties, including their duties and obligations relating to property that they own, support responsibilities of either or both of them, and provisions for any children. So when a marriage breaks up, divorce law provides legal solutions for issues that the husband and wife are unable to solve by mutual cooperation. And so again, it is a legal contract that now has to be dissolved. But it's also a moral contract. If you have, and a lot of those, the morality and the things that the church thought about and the positions they had on marriage and really coming forward and trying to help. I think the church did a good job of this sense of there is a moral responsibility. You can't just leave women and men destitute out here. I'm sorry, women and children destitute. That was the church's position, because the men were those who were powerful. They were the ones that owned money. Women actually had to give up their name because they became the man's property, which, we still see that happening today. And there are still lots of discussions around, should I give up my name? Should the woman take the man's name? And, it's different. Society is different now. So when you look back and you think about that, I think the church blessings and that requirement that said a priest has to bless this to become a necessary step for the marriage to be legally recognized back then, I think it did improve a lot of women and wives and children, because men were being taught to show greater respect for them. Remember, women were regarded as property, not as equals, but as property. And so that Christian doctrine really did declare that two were becoming one, and that men had a responsibility in the marriage to treat their wives well and to care for them afterwards, especially in the sense that most women were working in the home and caring for children in the home. And so they did not have the means to earn on their own. And if they were left, if the husband decided to go off and do something else, or just to not care for them well, then the church still held that men were the head of the families, with their wives kind of deferring to their wishes. That's that submission thing, I think, still. But it sort of gave them exclusive access to each other's body, if you will. And so love doesn't enter the picture till way, way later. It becomes a much more modern construct to think about love as the cause for marriage. Now, why is that? Why do you think that is? I have some thoughts about why that changed. And I think a lot of it was because women started to gain more rights in the society, like the right to vote. Women started to work more in the workplace. Some of that was driven by the necessity because men were off to war, and men were some of them didn't return home, unfortunately. And so women had to do what they needed to do to support their society, their families and the society. But now our cultural view is changing, but our climate, our need to grow in the same way was quite different. It was changing. So women didn't really have to sort of be hitched to that man as much, because there were opportunities for them to earn. There were opportunities for them to make their own way. And so that has shifted over time. And now we're in a situation where women earn, in many cases, as much as the man. Now, we still know there's a pay disparity, and there's not quite equity in society yet in terms of pay. However, for the most part, women can go out and work. So you've got two able-bodied adults deciding that they want to be together for some reason, and it's really not driven by finances. And so now, what is it driven by? It becomes, I love you, I want to be with you, I see a future for us. It's more about what you want to create and the life you want to create afterwards, as opposed to the necessity to survive, at least for the women, right? Because their whole view is different now, because society is different now. They have the ability to survive. And so I just found this so interesting. I think I'm going to continue to do more research on this and really bring together how the church looked at marriage and how society looked at marriage, and kind of church from a moral perspective, and the law and society from the legal perspective, to make sure that people were taken care of. So some really, really, honestly, some noble thoughts and plans and laws created behind it, with the purpose of nobility and making sure that all of society was cared for. But then, we get to today, and it just starts to to really break down. I wonder if the divorce rate was as much back then as it is today. And there's a part of me that says it probably was pretty high when the church had to say, okay, look, you need to give this woman a certificate of divorce. You can't just run off and leave. That probably was happening quite a bit if the church had to take a stance on it. And so I do think that there are, it sounded like it was kind of wild. The Bible is hilarious sometimes, and you read stuff and, you start to understand things were wild and crazy. And God was like, hold up. Wait, y'all are just out of control. Let me wait. This is like the parent coming in. Let me do some things here, because this is a mess. And so now the contemporary courts are really more involved in determining the legal ramifications of a breakup, all those things we talked about. And churches still have the moral perspective on marriage. So I want you to realize that they are two very different things. They're two different things. There are some things that intertwine because of the church's influence in politics and in creating laws. This is long-standing over many, many years ago. They're tied, but they're not tied at the same time. So when we approach a divorce and we're thinking that the court is about what's morally right, no, the court's not necessarily about what's morally right, even though there are some morality threads built into those laws. The court is about executing the legal outcomes that are law. So I think about now, if I step back and think about, okay, so before there were lots of laws to help make sure that women weren't just left out to dry because they were, because the man decided he wanted a divorce and she didn't have the ability to earn. Well, now the situation can be quite reversed, right? So women have the ability to earn. They earn just as much in some cases, and the law is still the law. And so that now applies to the man and the man not being left out to dry. Morally, there's some, I can see the moral threads there. Practically, there are sometimes I have problems with that one. I have problems with it because you have two able-bodied adults who should be able to go off and do what they need to do, especially if they're both working, right? So I'm interested in how you guys see that and think about that, because what I see happening a lot now is it's not the women who are leaving the marriages and needing to have the support. It winds up being men in many cases who are leaving, and those laws apply to them being supported. So that's interesting. That is very interesting. So you are listening to what's I Do, I Did, I Don't on What's in It for the Black People Media. This is Tasha. I want you to make sure that you are sharing. We're going to get into a little bit more about divorce now. We've talked a little bit more about marriage. We're going to get into the divorce side of it, and what does the Bible say about that on the other side of the break. Make sure you share this broadcast.
WIFTBPM.
Church Chicago's Power Hour. I'm your host, Angie Mims, and
Terrence Keys, TD, a.k.a. Terrence Daniels.
I wish I had one witness in the house.
You got one. You got a couple of them.
Got
two T's.
Give me a testimony.
Oh, Lord. He's did it before. Oh, Lord.
I got one. Better. I got 5 reasons.
5 reasons. Oh, Lord. He turned it around.
Turn it around. He woke me up this morning.
Oh. Don't do this. Don't do this.
Go
number
ahead.
4?
He woke me up this morning.
Come on, number 3. Come.
He woke me up.
Oh, Lord.
He woke you up.
That thing could touch you.
I'm
One
telling
of
you.
them 5s will get you. What's the second one?
He woke me up this morning.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh my God.
And the number 1 reason,
Number 1. Final answer.
he woke me up this morning.
He woke me up this morning.
That's a testimony.
That's a
Turn that thing
testimony.
Can I talk to you, lady? Just the other day, I ran into a good old friend of yours, and I had to ask her, how have you been? She told me you were engaged and happy. My heart fell to the floor, I know it should have been me, but I couldn't see you with no one else. But I'll believe it when I see you standing there. I believe it invisible, no one could take my place. I still get funny feelings when I see your face. I know the love we shared was so real. In spite of all the ups and downs that we've been through, sometimes I wish I was there with you to share your world. You were my girl, I'm still in love with you. But I know you better off with, 'cause obviously it wasn't meant to be. I'm so glad to see you happy. But your love and life goes on. We had to go our separate ways. You found someone for you, I found someone for me. Oh, but I believe it. I see you standing there. I believe it. To tell you how I feel. Can I tell you how I feel? You believe it. Oh, you're leaving me forever, baby. Please, baby, listen here. See, I got down on my knees and I began to beg the Lord, please don't let it be known. I love that woman. I love that woman. I see you standing there. Oh, tell you how I can I tell you how I feel? You believe. Oh, I can't believe.
All right, welcome back to I Do, I Did, I Don't on What's in It for the Black People Media. This is Tasha here. We are talking about marriage and divorce and the church perspective. We did a little bit of history before the break, so I want you to make sure that you're sharing this broadcast. Make sure that you are following What's in It for the Black People Media so that you get all of the notifications when the shows are coming on. And make sure you are following I Do, I Did, I Don't on Facebook. So before the break, we were talking about just how marriage has evolved over time. You know, the earliest humans really had no real use for marriage, no real need for it. They could, the way society was and culturally, just the climate and everything, people were able to support themselves and eat, essentially. And so over time, things changed. Folks started to kind of connect to each other in this way, and marriage became a very practical means for survival, really. And so we're not quite in that situation anymore. Over time, the church had a lot of influence in what now marriage looked like, and it became less of a social contract between folks, but something that the church had some influence in, and then it became more legal. So over time, this has sort of progressed, and the reason, in a lot of ways, was about making sure that people were cared for, especially if a marriage ended. So there was some influence in thinking morally, this is your responsibility to this other person when you decide to get married. We are going to try to influence that and teach society that this is how this should go. But this is also your responsibility once you are no longer married. And the church now had a lot of influence in creating some of these laws. And the origin of marriage before being a legal contract, essentially, you know, I read something that said that the origin of marriage was to create a legal contract by which a man could acquire a female slave. And at first I thought, well, that's just slavery. But then I thought, okay, well, maybe that's a little tongue in cheek, because essentially the woman worked around the house, and maybe that was their way of saying that. So really interesting. But there really was an economic story that explained the origin of this institution of marriage. That was before. It also, became later. It's interesting to say this because I'm looking at things in two different ways, right? So men and women created by God early on, Adam and Eve. God marries them in the Garden of Eden. And so from the very beginning, there was this recognition that we needed each other and needed each other's help. And God bound them together through a covenant. So it wasn't a legal thing. It was, this is an agreement that you're made. But then those agreements were broken. And so how did the church handle that? And what did God say about that when those agreements were then broken? And God had a whole lot to say about it in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. So, there was a lot going on. And Moses said, all right, we need to give women certificates of divorce, which men needed to provide that, which allowed for the women and men to be cared for, but also religiously, women and children, I keep saying that, the women and children to be cared for. But also, religiously, it freed now the woman to go on to something else. And there's a lot of church debate around whether people can remarry afterwards, what reasons they can divorce, lots of different things. But what I will say is God actually clearly, in my mind, given this, was not someone that said you can't get divorced. I don't think that he wants us to sign up to be miserable for the rest of our lives if it's just not working. And so in that case, when men wanted to walk away, the Bible said, the Bible does say, women were given these certificates of divorce. So when I think about then how did God really feel about that, right? And I looked at this scripture. Actually, the Bible does have quite a few scriptures on marriage and on divorce. I was surprised. So you look in Jeremiah, this prophet is talking to Israel about their adultery. There is a very strong scripture and very strong language here. And because it's Easter, that's why we're talking this, right? So Jeremiah says in God's words to Israel that he gave Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. So, okay, adultery clearly is a grounds for divorce, right? In this biblical sense. God says that he saw that her unfaithful sister Judah had no fear, and she also went out and committed adultery. So essentially, what God was saying to these folks is, y'all out here whoremongering, these my people, you're supposed to be wedded to me as a nation, but you guys are following all these other gods. You're out here doing everything. We've agreed that you have one God, that's me. But you're out here basically being adulterous and you're doing all this other stuff. And so God gave them, he basically said, I'm giving y'all a certificate of divorce because you're being unfaithful. So in some sense, God is a divorced being himself because of the issue of adultery and unfaithfulness. And so, you look at this and you think, that's a very, very strong language. And I think in part, a lot of it was, it was kind of a parable in some ways, or a metaphor. I won't say a parable. I will say it was more metaphorical in that sense, but it very much shows you, I think, the heart of God. Does he want this nation to stay together? Does he want them to be faithful? Yes. But if you're going to continue to step out and do what you want to do and not abide by the covenant, then clearly grounds for divorce, right? And so then we get to the New Testament time. So a couple of the big arguments are, does God support divorce? How does he feel about it? Should the church allow it? I mean, you can argue it, but the fact is it's happening already anyway. So, but I do think that there's evidence in the Bible that supports it. Not in all cases, and yes, you should absolutely put your all into trying to make it work. But when it's not going to, and the covenant is broken because one party or both parties decide not to abide by that covenant any longer, or that, then, okay, it's time to move on. And there are provisions for that. So then we get to the New Testament, right? The New Testament says a woman is bound to her, this is 1 Corinthians 7:39. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. Okay. So this basically says that the woman is bound to the husband as long as he's alive. When he dies and she becomes a widow, she's able to remarry. But if he doesn't die, this seems to suggest that she's unable to marry again. So that's another discussion and sort of argument that I see happening a lot in the church. Once you are divorced, can you remarry? And it's an interesting debate to me because I don't really know why it's a debate, because it's a debate for the woman, but it's not a debate for the man. Again, that sort of lends itself back to the patriarchal nature of our society and how that's been built over time. But it's usually this sense, and I did have a pastor say to me, you can't remarry. Okay. I'm going to take kind of the things that make sense, the things that I know to be true. I'm going to listen because I'm teachable. I'm going to listen. But, I'm going to separate kind of the wheat from the chaff, if you will. And I'm not sure that I'm on the same page with that. And that's because there were way back in time 2 different theories around remarrying and not remarrying within the church. And I want to do more research on that before I start trying to really talk about it. But there were some that thought, no, you can't. And others who said, yes, you can. And so, okay, I'm going to keep looking. I'm going to keep looking at these biblical scriptures and try to understand what this really means. So I look at Romans 7, verses 2 and 3. And it says, for example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law that binds her to him. So then, if she has sexual relations with another man while her husband is still alive, she is called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is released from that law and is not an adulteress if she marries another man. So why would it be that the covenant can be broken if the husband dies? There's no longer a marriage between the two, right? But if he breaks the covenant, why is it also not broken? And all of those same things apply. So if he breaks the covenant, then isn't she then released from the marriage in the same way? And why is this scripture only talking about women and what she can and can't do as opposed to what men can do? Because again, patriarchy, I have some problems with this sometimes. And I'm trying to understand, and I'm really trying to make sure that I'm giving this the opportunity. But we also have to realize that culture definitely does influence how we look at these things and how what we looked at before, and the cultural context is different, right? So, it just gets interesting because there's a lot here about how the woman in 1 Corinthians, if the man doesn't want to get divorced, basically she must not divorce him. And, if he's willing to stay and work on it. And it's just really interesting because for me, it just sometimes feels like the church is willing to keep people in bondage. And I don't necessarily believe that that is God's intent. I don't believe that is his intention. I believe that he cares for his people. He cares specifically for his daughters and making sure that they are taken care of and that they were not taken advantage of back then. I think he cares for his sons also, and in thinking through what their heart is and their heart posture, knowing that the construct in society was that they had more rights, they had more property, they could own property. Women couldn't even own property, that women became their property, which is crazy to think. But all of those things, I think God, knowing that this is how things were set up, he spoke to men a lot about their hearts in marriage, and to women about their actions, I would say, a little bit more. So I find it interesting. I just find the whole thing interesting. I really believe that God has every intention for us to be well, for us to be cared for. And I think he has made the provisions that we needed in terms of marriage and divorce. And if you're two that are going to work on it and work after it, great. That's awesome. But if one party is just not, it takes two, right? It takes two. If one party is not willing, or one party is just going to keep doing whatever they're doing, then that's not in line with the covenant of the marriage. Then, do you stay and subject yourself to such abuse? I'm going to call it abuse, is what it winds up being. And I don't think that God has created, I don't think that's his intention. I really don't. I do think that it's very interesting as I was reading through this and just talking about how people moved over time, that every 3 or 4 years they just sort of wander off and start a new family or something. Every 3 to 4 years tends to be that point at which we're like, I don't know if this is working. It's when divorce rates peak in modern day marriages. And I'm a bit nerdy. So when I start researching and looking at things, I just find a lot interesting, and I start to make connections and see where the correlations are. And I'm trying to figure out what causes what sometimes, but that is very interesting when you think about it, because as humans, we are, there's so much in us that's just innate. And so I don't know. What do y'all think? So marriage, definitely legal contract, but then morally, you've got this other sense. And I do believe that God has made provisions for both marriage, and secondarily, I believe that he's made provisions for divorce in the cases where that's necessary, all with the viewpoint of making sure that people are taken care of. So now let's take that influence, that moral influence, now going over to the court and the laws that are created, right? So you're standing in front of the judge, and the judge is now making decisions about divorce and division of property and children and all of that. And the biggest influence is making sure that financially, in his or her mind as the judge on the bench in this case, they're thinking about, how do I make sure that each of these parties is financially on good footing and can sustain themselves after this legal contract ends? Because this legal contract gave you rights to property, to whatever property, money, land, whatever it is, right? Your home, all of that stuff. But it gave you access. Those things basically amount to money. And so when we're talking about divorce, and a lot of times about the money that's associated with it and the issues of money, that is why. Because it really is, from a legal perspective, about making sure that both parties can stand on their own 2 feet once they're done, knowing that their economic situation is going to change. Because really, when this started, the origin of marriage was really about economics. At least in all right, so I feel like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here. So on the one hand, you have the origin of marriage with God and those that espouse to those religious beliefs. And then you have the origin of marriage with society and those who may not have a spouse to those beliefs. And at some point, some of those overlapped and kind of melded together, and you started getting the influence of religion into that. So when I say that, it sounds, if you've not heard the whole conversation, it sounds like I'm saying, well, the origin of marriage was only economic and there wasn't this religious piece and God created marriage. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just talking about the kind of these two tracks of how marriage came to be and how marriage was viewed in society. So I interesting. And I say that a lot, really interesting. All of this sort of leads me at one point to start asking the question, all right, so marriage, the creation of marriage, morally was about these two parties joining and making sure that people were well taken care of and not taken advantage of. The other side of this, legally, kind of the same thing, right? You've settled on a normal way that you organize your family and that you move about the world, and now that's going to change, and you have to make sure legally that both parties are going to be okay. afterwards in terms of how everything is divided. So, now that women and men can earn and they're both responsible for feeding and caring for their own children, if there are children involved, there are no children, I think this becomes a lot, it should become easier, but oftentimes it's not. But, the laws were created in order to make sure that both parties are supported afterwards. So now that you have women and men, both able-bodied, in a social construct that allows for both of them to work as able-bodied adults, then now I'm starting to wonder, is there really a need for marriage? Is there still a need? Because marriage then sort of lends itself later on, when it's not working, to divorce. And this has been an issue that's happened over time for a very long time, since the beginning. You've had folks wilding out, not doing what they need to do to live up to the covenant of marriage, to the legal contract of marriage, and folks taking advantage in some ways of the other person during the marriage, and then afterwards kind of leaving them destitute in many ways. So, I start wondering, people ask me a lot, all right, do you think you would get married again? I don't know. I don't really see the benefit. I'm not sure that, aside from, okay, now I love this person, when I think about, can you love this person and not be married? I think that's possible. Does that square with how I think about things religiously? Not necessarily, but, maybe. And maybe there's really not a need for it anymore. I don't know, because we're now in a situation where this is not a practical thing that we need to do in order to survive for most of us. There are some people that probably do. But for most of us in this day and age, in this society, we have the ability to earn. And if we've done what we need to do, we have the ability to earn and don't need to hitch to someone in order to support ourselves. And so then I started to ask that question. Well, then what's the point? What's the point of marriage? Is it just because you love someone? Do you have to take that next step to marry someone? Or is there some other reason? Is it because we have been taught that religiously the right moral thing to do is to marry as opposed to living in sin, let's say, because, you don't want to be somebody that's fornicating. And so is that the reason really to get married? Because you want to have sex and you don't want to, it's interesting. It's interesting. That's my word. It's interesting. And there's a lot to think about there in terms of whether that really, what you are deciding to do and why you are deciding to do it. Now, when you are building a life together and, you were bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, young, thinking, okay, we're going to build this life together and this is going to be wonderful, fantastic. Now you're in a position, you're divorced, you've probably built your life, and you're thinking, I kind of got this. I got this. And if I'm going to legally bind myself to someone, that means then it gives them right to what I have. I don't know if it makes sense anymore, but that's me. You guys have to determine for you. But I'm here to ask some questions and to get you to thinking about some things so that when it's said and done, if you do find yourself in a divorce, that you can be better on the other side of that divorce. Y'all have a wonderful Easter. It's been great to talk with you today, and I will see you next Sunday.
And I had to ask her, how have you been? She told me you were engaged and happy. My heart fell to the floor. I know it should have been me, but I couldn't see you with no one else. But I'll believe it. I feel, yeah. I still get funny feelings when I see your face. I know the love we shared was so real. In spite of all the ups and downs that we've been through, sometimes I wish I was there with you.